Good afternoon. My name is George Perkovich from the Carnegie Endowment, and I'm going to talk a little bit by way of introduction as people settle into the room. And it's good to see you all here. Our topic today is the legality of nuclear deterrence. This is not a topic that you tend to find on cable television, political shows, or on op-ed pages, or in presidential debates, or probably, if you're lucky, at your summer barbecues. But it is an important topic, and it's important for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons why questions of the legality of nuclear deterrence is so important and often underappreciated is that the women and men whose job it is would be to carry out nuclear operations, to manage our nuclear weapons and conduct operations with them, they understandably need to know that what they might be asked to do is well considered and legal and legitimate. And in many ways, obviously, society owes them that kind of deliberation. So it's a quite important topic. And it's also, obviously, as we'll hear from Newell, not so simple. The legality of deterrence may be distinguishable from the legality of using nuclear weapons. So the hope with deterrence is that the threat or the possibility of using these weapons would prevent you from ever actually having to do it. But if that fails and the decision to actually use the weapons occurs, a whole different set of legal considerations may be necessary. And if this kind of question isn't being addressed in Moscow or other capitals, then we should at least be glad that it's being addressed here and that people like you were coming out to be part of this discussion. Our speaker, Newell Highsmith, I think will also point out that this question is likely to become more salient, at least in some international political debates over the next few years, which again reinforces the idea behind the excellent paper that he's written on the same topic, on the legality of nuclear deterrence. This paper was produced by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory's Center for Global Security Research. It's free. You can download it from that website. When I Googled last night thinking of how to tell you to do this, I looked up legality of nuclear deterrence, and the first thing that popped up was the advertisement for today's discussion. If you click on that, there's a link to the paper through that way, so that would be an efficient way to do it. Newell acquired his expertise on this topic from a very long and distinguished career in the State Department. And from 2001 to 2017, he supervised the section of the legal office at State that dealt with nonproliferation and arms control. So he's got considerable experience on exactly this topic. Newell is going to take you through the essence of his analysis and argument. I'll make a few comments, and then we'll open it up for a discussion with you all. But thanks again for joining me. Cool.
Thank you, George, and thank you to Carnegie for hosting the discussion. I also would like to thank Brad Roberts and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory for the support they've provided me in producing the paper and in having these opportunities to present my paper. So it was almost exactly 2 years ago that 122 nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. 69 nations declined to participate in the adoption of the treaty, and that included all of the nuclear weapon states, the states that possess nuclear weapons, and that is a distinction. Nuclear weapon states usually refers to the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, but there are additional nuclear weapon states or states that have acquired nuclear weapons as well. Now, the treaty has not entered into force, and so far only about half of the 50 state ratifications have been completed, so it's unclear when it will enter into force. The weapons ban treaty was not drafted with a view to gaining the adherence of the states that possess nuclear weapons, and if you review the treaty, that becomes fairly evident. But it was intended to send a strong message seeking to delegitimize nuclear weapons. And experience suggests that the advocates for that treaty will not end their efforts with that treaty, but may pursue additional avenues as well. And one of those would be to try to re-engage the International Court of Justice on the issue of the legality of nuclear weapons. And that was what led to the decision to pursue this topic. In 1966, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Every one of the 14 judges wrote a separate or dissenting opinion. It was a highly divided court. Only half of the judges supported the final opinion of the court. And I want to read the two critical elements of that finding in that advisory opinion. The first is that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict. And by the term rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, they're referring to basically what's often referred to as the laws of war or international humanitarian law, or sometimes shortened to IHL. The second key finding was that notwithstanding that the threat or use would generally be contrary to the laws of war, the court could not conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state was at stake. So there's three elements to these two findings that I want to focus on in the majority of my comments. And the first is that the key to the decision was the analysis of the law of armed conflict. And the two critical elements of the law of armed conflict that were in play were, first of all, the requirement that any use of force must be proportional, and second of all, that an attack must be capable of distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. And the second concept is also known as discrimination or distinction. And I'll get into those further a little later in the discussion. The second key element I want to talk about is that the court identified one scenario, and only one scenario, where it could not quite decide whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful. And that was, as I said, an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state would be at stake. The third element I want to talk about, and the main topic of my paper, is that the finding of illegality or general likelihood of illegality applied to both actual use and to the threat of use. And because it also applied to the threat of use, it does implicate the practice of nuclear deterrence. And before I talk about these three key elements, I would like to talk briefly about some of what the ICJ did not find. First of all, the ICJ acknowledged that there was no per se prohibition against nuclear weapons in international law. There's no treaty that bans nuclear weapons altogether. And indeed, even the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is not in force, and even when it is in force, it will not be adhered to, or it doesn't appear that it will be adhered to by the states that possess nuclear weapons. In addition, there is no prohibition against, per se prohibition against nuclear weapons under customary international law. Now, customary international law is similar to common law in a domestic legal context. It is law that accumulates over time, and it is based on two elements. One is the settled practice of states, and the other is that the states that engage in that settled practice believe they are doing so as a matter of legal requirement. So the next question is, what is the settled practice of states within the nuclear era? Well, that settled practice would suggest that nuclear weapons are indeed legitimate. The nuclear weapon states and their allies have possessed nuclear weapons and relied on them for deterrence throughout the nuclear era. These states, while represent a substantial minority of all states, but in addition, if you count the allies as well as the actual states that possess nuclear weapons, but in addition, they represent a huge percentage of the population, the land mass, and the economic power of the planet as a whole. Secondly, there are numerous treaties that have addressed nuclear issues during the nuclear era, but none of them purports to abolish nuclear weapons altogether, except, as I mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to which those key states are not parties. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the foundation of the nonproliferation regime, allows for 5 states to continue to possess nuclear weapons. It's provided for in the treaty. And as we know, in addition, 4 additional states are believed to possess nuclear weapons beyond those 5. There are a number of nuclear weapons-free zone treaties that bar all nuclear weapons in particular parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia, et cetera. All of these have protocols that they want adhered to by the nuclear weapon states. In other words, they also contemplate that countries will continue to possess nuclear weapons, and it is very important to the countries in those zones to get assurances from the nuclear weapon states that they're not going to use those nuclear weapons against them in exchange for them foregoing nuclear weapons in the entire region. And finally, of course, there are many, or a number of treaties that limit nuclear stockpiles or that limit nuclear testing, but none of those purport to eliminate nuclear weapons or prohibit nuclear weapons altogether. So with that background, I want to go back and go through those 3 key elements of the court's finding that I mentioned earlier. The first is that indeed the law of armed conflict was the basis that the court relied upon for finding that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to international law. Every state that presented views to the ICJ in that case, and that includes the United States and Russia, agreed that the law of war does apply to nuclear weapons. They did not try to treat nuclear weapons as different from other types of weapons. So, as I mentioned earlier, the 2 principles of the law of war that are most applicable in this case are proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality means that the expected harm from an attack must not be excessive in relation to the military advantage expected to be gained from the attack. In other words, it's one of the mechanisms for limiting collateral damage. That you do not want to have excessive harm compared to the military advantage you're trying to attain. Discrimination, which is also referred to as distinction, requires that an attack must be capable of distinguishing between the armed forces and the civilian population. Again, this means that civilians cannot be targeted as such, but the key words are as such. It does not mean that there cannot be collateral damage in which civilians are harmed in connection with an attack on a legitimate military target. So I want to look first at the application of these principles of the law of war to the actual use of nuclear weapons, and then I'll come back at the latter part to talk about their application to nuclear deterrence. In my view, and this view has raised a few eyebrows, I think the court was actually correct in concluding that the actual use of nuclear weapons would be very difficult to square with proportionality and discrimination under the law of war. I think in any actual case that nuclear weapons were used, they would likely be disproportionate, and there would be minimal capacity to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Under the Obama administration, nuclear planners were directed to ensure that our nuclear use plans complied with the international humanitarian law, the law of war. And the planners have noted in writings that they do not target civilian populations per se, which is, of course, one of the requirements of the law of war. Nevertheless, and this is without questioning the sincerity of the efforts of those nuclear planners or that they are doing the absolute best job they can to comply with the laws of war, certain concerns would still continue to exist, in my view. First is that the nuclear use plans would generally be implemented in a hasty situation involving incomplete information. That's just the nature of war. And under those circumstances, the ability to choose which option best comports with the law of war may be limited. Secondly, legitimate military objectives are not limited just to the armed forces of your opponent, and they're not limited just to the war waging capacity of your opponent, which would be things like missile factories and transportation lines, but can also include your opponent's war sustaining activities. That could be things like electrical supply sources and other kinds of industrial facilities that aren't directly supporting the war effort, but support the country's ability to sustain an attack. So on top of this sort of broad range of permissible targeting, in each of those cases you would have some amount of permissible collateral damage, because collateral damage is something that is permissible. You have an obligation to minimize collateral damage, and not to engage in an attack if that collateral damage would be excessive. But as we know from actual experience, there is almost always some collateral damage in war. And in addition to this, of course, any plans that seek to limit the amount of nuclear exchange that occurs, there's always a risk that of nuclear escalation by one side or both sides that would lead to a much greater devastation than is originally in those plans. Despite my belief that in most of these realistic scenarios, the use of nuclear weapons would be very likely to violate the law of war, very likely is not the same as definitely. I don't think it is possible to say that every possible use of nuclear weapons would definitely violate the law of war. And in the absence of a legal basis for such a blanket finding, I think the court was correct to refrain from making that kind of blanket finding in its ICJ decision in 1966. This brings us to the second key element that I wanted to talk about, which is the exception that was a possible exception that was identified by the court. That possible exception, again, was for extreme circumstances of self-defense involving survival of the state. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because, in brief, I think that the court provided no legal support for carving out that particular exception. In addition to that, it's not clear what they mean by survival of the state. Do they mean, as one of my colleagues has pointed out, do they mean survival of the state as an independent political entity? Do they mean survival of the particular government that's in control of that state? Or do they mean the physical survival of the population of that state? So which of those you choose could have a significant effect on how you judge what survival of the state consists of. So in my view, the court would have been better off stopping at saying we can't determine that nuclear use would be illegal in all circumstances and not try to single out one scenario in which that might constitute a possible exception. So that brings me to the third key element I wanted to talk about and the main thrust of my paper, which is nuclear deterrence. The ICJ advisory opinion treated the threat of nuclear use the same as actual use of nuclear weapons. And that's consistent with international law. It's consistent with the UN Charter and the way threats and actual use are treated in the use of force. Therefore, its conclusion that the use of nuclear weapons would generally be illegal would also apply to nuclear deterrence if nuclear deterrence is deemed to be a threat to use nuclear weapons. And even the US judge, who disagreed with most of the findings of the court, concluded that if a threat of possible use did not inhere in deterrence, deterrence would not deter. And therefore, most of the judges concluded that in some way, nuclear deterrence does constitute a threat to use nuclear weapons. The problem, of course, is that if nuclear use would generally be contrary to international humanitarian law, as long as nuclear weapons exist, you still want nuclear deterrence. It's essential to minimize the risk of actual use. And that's the conundrum I think that the court was grappling with. So the question is, does nuclear deterrence constitute an illegal threat to use nuclear weapons? And again, that was the main thrust of my paper. Clearly, it is possible to make a nuclear threat that does violate the laws of war. If, say, Russia threatened Ukraine that it would use nuclear weapons against Ukraine unless it ceded part of its territory, that would be a violation of the laws of war. The threat would be coercive, it would be very specific, and it would be a direct threat. But in my view, that is not representative of the nature of nuclear deterrence. And it's certainly not in its most important role, and its most important role, of course, is to deter an initial nuclear attack. The threat in nuclear deterrence is non-coercive in the sense that it is trying to avert a nuclear catastrophe. It's not trying to coerce another country into doing something that it doesn't want to do. Secondly, that threat is non-specific. It's not, if we're attacked, we're going to launch all our missiles. There are a wide range of options that might be used in responding under nuclear deterrence. that are part of the concept of nuclear deterrence, and that includes the option of not using nuclear weapons in response to an attack. And finally, the threat is highly attenuated. It is contingent on the state relying on nuclear deterrence being attacked wrongfully by another state with nuclear weapons, and it's contingent on the victim state choosing to respond with nuclear weapons. So in those ways, in my view, the nuclear deterrence is hardly distinguishable from the deterrence that is relied upon with conventional weapons. States have standing armies, and they have those standing armies to deter an attack. States station forces overseas, as we do in South Korea, again to deter attack. And states occasionally send naval forces into regions of conflict, again to deter attack. All of these examples involve a contingent threat. The same as nuclear deterrence arguably involves a contingent threat. And in some of those cases I cited with conventional weapons, the threat is actually more specific and less attenuated than what occurs with nuclear deterrence. But those examples of deterrence with conventional forces generally aren't viewed as being contrary to the laws of war. And I think the same should hold for nuclear deterrence. In addition, if you're assessing the applicability of the law of war to nuclear deterrence, it has to be based on, in any circumstance, on facts. So for example, what is the nature and scope of the attack that you're responding to? What is the risk of further attack by that opponent? And on your side of the ledger, what is the nature and the number of weapons that you plan to use and targets you plan to attack in response? What steps might you take to minimize collateral damage? All of that is highly factual and is very difficult to do an assessment of international humanitarian law with so many factual variables in play. As again, one of my colleagues wrote, it is difficult enough to assess the legality of hypothetical uses of nuclear weapons, and it seems even more difficult to assess the legality of hypothetical threats to use nuclear weapons. And finally, the principle of proportionality does not mean that you can only respond to a use of force with an equal responsive use of force. You measure the proportionality by the nature of the threat. And a defensive use of force can exceed the force that was used in the attack. Take, for example, the invasion of Kuwait. The response by the U.S. and its coalition forces was much greater in terms of use of force in order to dislodge the Iraqi army and to assure that there was no recurrence of the attacks. And that's involving an actual use of force. When you're looking at nuclear deterrence, which is a contingent threat to use force, I believe even more latitude is justified than in actual use. So for example, it is arguably permissible for a major nuclear response to be used to deter even a limited nuclear attack by another country. Take, for example, what I assume the North Koreans assume would be if they made a limited nuclear attack on the United States, they would be risking a massive nuclear retaliation. And it is not necessarily the case that response is therefore, in a nuclear deterrence context, disproportionate. So to sum up, I'm personally very sympathetic with the cause of eliminating nuclear weapons. It's disturbing, as many of the judges on the ICJ pointed out, it's disturbing that a handful of countries could, either by miscalculation or just stupidity, devastate most of the planet. And it's disturbing even if that outcome is not very likely in reality. Clearly, the advocates for the weapons ban are very dedicated to their cause, and therefore, I think it is fair to assume that they will not rely solely on the treaty in their efforts to delegitimize nuclear weapons, and that could involve a return to the International Court of Justice. And you never know with a different set of justices what that outcome might be. In my view, the court would be wrong as a matter of law if it found that nuclear deterrence was illegal, certainly at least in its primary role of deterring a nuclear attack. Moreover, I think a decision along those lines by the ICJ would not comport with the actual reality of nuclear deterrence in the world. It would be the court going beyond its mandate to interpret the law and rather be the court attempting to make law. And its decision would be ignored and criticized by the major powers, which I think would be harmful to the reputation and legitimacy of the court. Even if the world would be safer without nuclear weapons, as long as those nuclear weapons exist, my view is that nuclear deterrence is essential. The elimination of nuclear weapons requires the hard work of treaty negotiation, and those treaty negotiations need to involve the states that possess nuclear weapons, and they need to address the very difficult verification issues involved in assuring that no state has retained its nuclear weapons and that no state is cheating by trying to reconstitute its nuclear weapons or make nuclear weapons for the first time. In my view, there's no credible shortcut to the treaty approach to eliminating nuclear weapons. And again, thank you very much for this opportunity to address this issue.
Thanks, Newell. Thanks. Okay, so I've got a couple of thoughts and questions that I'll raise, and then we'll open it up to you all. I guess the first question, I think, was, at least to my mind, you talk very candidly and throughout the paper about the likelihood or near likelihood that if nuclear weapons were actually used, the effects could be catastrophic, and that to keep within the laws of armed conflict in actual use, it would be much better to have less weapons involved, lower yields, targets away from populations, and so on. And I guess that my question is, why, and this isn't directed just at you, but just in general, why don't we focus more on trying to spell out the conditions in terms of the sizes of arsenals, the types of weapons, the targeting, that not only the US, but that any state could adopt, which conditions would lower the probabilities of violating the laws of armed conflict and causing humanitarian disasters? We tend not to talk in those terms.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's a fair question. Is there a set of prescriptions that you could come up with that would make it much more likely that any use of nuclear weapons would be consistent with international law? I think that, and I guess what you're suggesting is that trying to come up with that might be a more achievable goal than the elimination altogether. I'd defer to nuclear planners and nuclear strategists on that, whether, I know some people think that reducing the numbers actually may increase the risk of a nuclear exchange, but I think that's the kind of study that it's worth somebody who has that expertise engaging in. I think it's a fair question.
And I've just always noticed that those questions haven't been addressed, or people haven't analyzed comparative arsenals in those terms. So we have 9 states with nuclear weapons. They're all fairly different. So the lowest number would be North Korea, the highest number would be Russia, and the US is close to Russia, and there's a big spectrum between there. And so kind of filtering that through questions about the propensity to violate international humanitarian law.
One of the problems with grappling with the legality of nuclear weapons, whether it's the ICJ grappling with it or experts trying to do it, is that the laws of war, as I mentioned earlier, are very fact-specific. And the range of possible options are so broad that it would take, there would be perhaps a very wide range of possible configurations of what you're talking about in terms of size and type of weapons that might increase your likelihood of comporting with international law. But it would be a daunting task to try to figure all those possible permutations out. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried, but it would be a daunting task.
Actually, then that raises another question, and I don't know if when you were in the State Department, if part of your job was interacting with Strategic Command, for example. So Strategic Command in Omaha is kind of in charge of operating U.S. nuclear forces, major role in developing the targeting plans and operational plans for that. And they're very explicit that they do all of that, as you said, with the laws of armed conflict in mind. They have lawyers involved who are very, very serious going through all of this. And so so we say that, the guidance for employment of nuclear weapons should follow those laws. But was there ever kind of review of that, or kind of, back and forth as would happen in a legal argument on the same team, but for the purposes of actually saying, okay, we say we're going to follow these principles, but how would you do it here, or how would you do it there? Does that kind of review ever happen?
Not that I've been involved in, but honestly, that would be more Defense Department and JCS lawyers. And I cite in my paper a really interesting article by General Keller, who was the former commander of the Strategic Forces, who goes through what he viewed as a big change in their nuclear planning, that they were starting to really take into account the laws of war and think hard about all these issues, and having their lawyers involved in a way that they had not been previously. And so, really interesting article that I would recommend to everybody. But there's also been critiques of that approach that say that, as I mentioned earlier, you can have those plans, you can try to design those plans to be as compliant as possible, but when push comes to shove, how capable will you be of exercising your response in a way that does comport with the laws of war in situations that are no doubt going to be taxing, to say the least, and where you have a wide range of options? How do you consider those in a timely fashion in the fog of war? And so I think those are legitimate questions to ask. And in addition, even though their plans comport with the laws of war, by their analysis, we have very broad permissible targeting rules of engagement. And when you're talking about nuclear weapons engaging with the armed forces and the war waging capabilities like weapons plants, and the war sustaining capabilities like industrial facilities and power plants, the result could be the complete devastation of a country and the ability of that country, that society to function, as and the impact on the population could be huge. But I think those discussions are ones that I hope they're having, because it sounds like they have had very rigorous looks at their laws of war, at their nuclear plans to try to comport with the laws of war.
I mean, from the completely other side, Scott Sagan, a renowned political scientist at Stanford, a friend of many people in this room, he's been doing for the last several years public opinion surveys, I guess surveying respondents in the U.S. about scenarios of using nuclear weapons, and to get perspectives. And the responses, one was probably a month or 6 weeks ago that came out, and it got a lot of attention in the press about how, let's say, willing respondents were to see the U.S. use nuclear weapons against, for example, North Korea, where actually, when given a choice of, one set of casualties that would be caused by this use of nuclear weapons versus a much higher set of casualties, a surprisingly large number said, do the higher casualties. And he interviewed somebody who says, we want them all dead. So the tension that would exist within the body politic as you're kind of mounting up, where the law is saying be as restrained as possible, but given what might have been the precipitating attack on the U.S., the political momentum could be quite different. And so these kind of conversations, right, I think a lot of people, if they heard about it, they said, wait, what? You got lawyers talking about this?
No, I think there would be huge pressure if the North Koreans hit one U.S. city. I think there would be huge pressure to respond in a massive way with nuclear weapons, and I think that applies in other scenarios as well. I've grappled with the question, if the U.S. sees a significant attack coming, presumably from Russia, since they're the most capable of launching such an attack, what is the legality of a massive counterstrike? Are we trying to deter future additional attacks beyond that, or do we simply want to retaliate? Because if you hit us, we're going to hit you back. Retaliation is not a legitimate military objective. But what's the reality as a political matter when you're engaged in that kind of conflict?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, and I'm not going to ask you to do it here, but more broadly, that raises the question, well, why do we care about international law? I mean, and I think the retaliation one is a good example. So U.S. is basically know it's about to be destroyed or largely destroyed by nuclear weapons. There's nothing you can do to stop those weapons from landing here. What do you do? And people say, well, respond massively. And you say, well, it's not going to prevent any more deaths, in the U.S. It's retaliation. And somebody said, well, that's not legal. And I think a lot of people would say, well, I don't care if it's legal. And so that issue is not one that we think about much or debate, especially since the end of the Cold War.
Even a significant nuclear exchange in South Asia would have huge effects globally on every aspect of life. And I think it's a fair question. What is the role of international law at that point? In essence, international law has failed at that point. And while it may be important in cleaning up some of the legal niceties after that kind of catastrophe, it's extremely secondary to the primary goal of how do we get societies functioning again after such a cataclysm.
Actually, and that leads me to the last question I want to ask, and I want to open it up. But and this is, you just pointed to it actually. So a lot's written over decades about the legality of the threat to use nuclear weapons or the legality of use. You had the court ruling in 1996. The books have been written about this. And they're always kind of from the prospective point of view, like, would it be legal? And I always wonder, well, why isn't there more discussion? Why haven't states done more to set up mechanisms to adjudicate after use? So we've got almost all of the states that possess nuclear weapons, certainly the U.S. and the UK and France, as you mentioned, they've all said they would follow the laws of armed conflict, number one. Number two, they all say they're responsible possessors, so they treat these weapons very seriously. They all say they're not aggressors, that they only have them for the purpose of deterrence and defense. They all say, basically, trust us with them. We're not going to give them up, even if those of you are pushing for us to get rid of them, but we're responsible about them, which seems to me to invite the question, okay, if all of that is true and you're responsible, then if you ever did use them, would you accept in advance international adjudication to make sure your conduct was as responsible and law-abiding and everything as you said? I think I know what the answer is going to be, which is, maybe on another planet. But I'm curious to get your views on it and to hear that debated. Because one of the responses could be, well, it doesn't do any good because we're all going to be dead after these things are used. But those same people say, actually, we could use nuclear weapons in a way that wouldn't cause humanitarian disaster and violate international law. So if that's the case, if you can manage escalation and not cause humanitarian disaster, then you're going to be around to be accountable, or somebody's going to be around to be accountable. So why not accept that kind of accountability?
I don't have an answer to that.
Okay. A new question.
I guess I would, my first response is what you already said, which is none of those countries will ever accept that. I mean, look at who accepts compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Look at who's joined the International Criminal Court. It's just, it'd be a tough call.
All right, let's open it up. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand and then we'll call on you, and then please introduce yourself. Anyone? Gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Vince Manzo from the Center for Naval Analysis. So So this discussion really, I think, is appropriate in light of the debate over the low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile that the U.S. government is in the process of implementing, and with a strong debate in Congress right now. So on the one hand, you have analysts and scholars such as Scott Sagan who say lower-yield weapons make a more credible deterrent. It's actually a more ethical deterrent. And if we were in a situation where we actually had to respond to nuclear use and try and prevent someone from using more weapons, a low-yield weapons probably gives you a better chance of doing that than a high-yield weapon. On the other hand, you have some prominent members of Congress and opponents of low-yield weapons who say, no, that's crazy. Even preparing for a limited nuclear war is very, very dangerous. We shouldn't do that. And in a sense, they're not kind of following the logic through, but they're really arguing for a massive retaliation strategy, which, based on the analysis I'm hearing here, sounds like it would be less consistent with the law of armed conflict. So I'd be interested in your views, both of your views on that issue. Thank you.
Before you answer, Newell, I want to give a plug. Vince Manzo, M-A-N-Z-O, written a great paper recently on kind of the future of arms control and the situation, primarily U.S., Russia, and China. So for those of you who are inclined to think and learn more about these issues, I can't recommend his paper. Tom Countryman, Ambassador Countryman's holding a copy of it, I believe, here. But Newell, please, it's a free spot. It's not a paid commercial.
I addressed low-yield nuclear weapons a little bit in my paper. I can't say that I'm persuaded that they would, in fact, improve the situation. I probably would go down as a skeptic of whether they improve deterrence, which is the theory behind them. The theory is that if our adversaries are thinking about the possibility of using low-yield weapons in, say, regional situations, they will be deterred better if we have low-yield weapons that we could respond with. And I honestly am a bit of a skeptic that they would change their evaluation of the likelihood of U.S. nuclear weapons as between strategic and low yield. And I think even a low yield exchange between the great powers would just pose a horrible risk of escalation and all of the things that you want to avoid. And these are not cost-free exercises. You're spending money on new weapons that you might have expended on stockpile stewardship or other elements of the program potentially. I've seen Scott's discussion of that, but I think his is not as an advocate for low yield weapons, although maybe perhaps in lieu of any strategic weapons. But I think he was just posing the possibility that yes, I think it is fair to say that use of low yield weapons, at least in theory, gives a greater chance of complying with international humanitarian law because you can target them more narrowly, collateral damage would be less, et cetera. But you could read my paper. I don't really come down on the side that that's a good way for us to go.
Vince, I would just add briefly, it seems to me that as a matter of principle and policy, that yes, one should seek to use the lowest yield possible to destroy whatever legitimate target is there, especially if that could have reduced harm on non-combatants and the environment, that it would be wrong not to do that. That hasn't been necessarily an approach. And then I think Newell's right, there's this legacy. So if we have a legacy of weapons that actually are much higher yield because their delivery systems weren't as accurate when they were deployed, so you had more yield to make sure you would destroy the target. Now if you've got better delivery, you could have lower yield, but there may be some expense or other difficulties in switching them out or redeploying. I mean, that becomes a policy issue, but I think as a matter of principle, it's worth stating the principle, and that to the extent that it's possible to switch lower yields or have lower yield options than higher yield, that should be done, it seems to me. And moreover, that having that debate internationally is a good debate to have for reasons that one could go on. But anyway, and maybe we'll have that debate here. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, and also the U.S. convener of Transcend International Network of Conflict Transformation. There's I've been to like many of these kinds of discussions since I've been in D.C., and there's a kind of level of absurdity to it where you're willing to kill like innocent people and really destroy the fragile planet because they have terrible leaders or because we have terrible leaders. And just a few points, I'm friends with the people that asked for the ICJ opinion and friends in New Zealand from Wirramantry in '96. And I've been to every NPT in New York since 2000 and was at the ban treaty. And also the NPT does not actually, is my understanding, allow for 5 states to have nuclear weapons, that they're committed to negotiate towards disarmament. But anyway, deterrence is a theory, and it holds up under some conditions, and it breaks down under certain conditions, and flips into spiral theory. And there's a lot of work done on that in social science. And also, if we get to that point, there's not much talk about tension reduction, diplomacy, or there's a strategy like from the 80s, GRIT, graduated reciprocated initiatives, and tension reduction where you ratchet down the tension. And Ralph K. White, a social psychologist, said that deterrence works if it's accompanied by drastic tension reduction. So if you're increasing the tension. So just that there's strategies of what's called second order change, where you deal with the underlying conflict, the relationship system, and the cause, understanding the cause of the conflict.
Thank you. This gentleman here, and then in the back there, Kayla, thanks.
I'm Hank Gaffney. I spent 13 years on NATO nuclear weapons. And in 1977, my guys led a NATO study, what it was called, the military implications of technology. And my guy demonstrated that nothing, no conventional, ever compares to a nuke. And I see a lot of discussion these days. This is filthy stuff. I did a lot of work to get rid of ADMs, for one thing. And of course, they're put in the ground and they would cause all kinds of bad stuff. And secondly, on this business of this low yield thing, it's supposed to go on a Poseidon or a Trident missile. We launch a Trident missile against somebody? That doesn't look like a mini nuke. I mean, this is ridiculous. I don't know why people are fooling around with this kind of stuff. This is very bad stuff, this nuclear stuff.
Hi, thanks. I learned a lot. I'm Martin Fleck.
Yeah.
I'm with Physicians for Social Responsibility. And Physicians for Social Responsibility, we agree with Beatrice Finn of ICANN, who said this sort of weapon should be illegal. And so my question is about you kind of laid a legal foundation that included the NPT. Diane Perlman already picked up on that. You said that the NPT says that, if I understood you right, it sounded like you were saying the NPT allows for 5 nations to have nuclear weapons. And I think that you left something out, which is the NPT allows for 5 nations to have nuclear weapons temporarily. And I also would purport that the vast majority of the signers, their understanding of the deal was that it was temporary. I asked Tom Graham about that. He said their understanding was it was temporary. There have been, last December, 162 nations at the UN called for total elimination of nuclear weapons. And it's been 49 years since the NPT entered into force. So how temporary? That's a long temporary arrangement, and we're still in a lot of danger. So that's my question is, how do you square this idea that the NPT allows 5 nations to permanently possess nuclear weapons, I think that does not square with the vast majority of the people who are parties to that treaty.
Yeah, I clearly should have mentioned Article 6 of the NPT. I knew it would come up in questions, though. I didn't mean to suggest that the NPT allows for 5 permanent nuclear weapon states. Obviously, there is a commitment in Article 6 of the NPT by all states, including the 5 nuclear weapon states under the treaty, to pursue negotiations in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. There's also an obligation under there for all states to pursue complete and
general disarmament.
And general disarmament. Thank you. And I agree with you. The countries that were agreed to forego their nuclear weapons did so on the expectations that at some point there would be these negotiations that would successfully result in nuclear disarmament. Of course, since that time, we have 4 additional nuclear weapon states who have no such obligations. So one of your problems is that even if the 5 came up with a disarmament plan, those 4 have no obligation under international law to join in with that. And none of the 4 seem inclined to give up their nuclear weapons. In addition to that, even if you go back to the time of the NPT, I agree the expectation was that they would give up there would be nuclear disarmament, but that was at the height of the Cold War. So what did they really expect in terms of a timetable? They didn't set a timetable in the NPT, nor could they, because you can't set a timetable realistically to compel states to agree to something as complicated as what are the provisions going to be for elimination, and how are you going to verify it? And because it's going to require extremely intrusive verification measures. And I think it had to have been understood at the time. I wasn't at those negotiations. I know Tom Graham was. It has to have been understood at the time that there would need to be some fundamental changes in the international security environment that would allow for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I think that has not occurred, and with the addition of 4 additional nuclear weapon states, it is further complicated that problem. But I don't want to minimize that there is that obligation, and I would agree that it is not easy in current circumstances to defend the proposition that the NPT parties are pursuing in good faith negotiations towards nuclear disarmament. It's a problem.
Thank you. Kayla, the woman in front of Martin there, right there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for being here. My name is Sana, and I'm with the American Enterprise Institute. I read the paper from outside by Toby Dalton on South Asia nuclear crises. My question is, other than military conflicts or flare-ups, are there any other trends that guide your research? For example, scientific developments in nuclear power with liquid salt technologies, or perhaps when countries invest heavily in nuclear energy, or are those separate from what you do?
I'll answer that, I guess.
Yeah, please.
We have worked here at Carnegie on various aspects of civilian nuclear energy, which I think is what you're referring to. In fact, we finished it 2012, work with all of the vendors, all the companies in the world. There were 13 of them that sell nuclear power plants internationally, to develop a voluntary code of conduct for their exports. One of the things that happened subsequently is the nuclear power industry is in very, very bad shape. The French company's nearly bankrupt. GE doesn't have a licensed reactor to sell. Westinghouse is nearly bankrupt. The South Koreans are doing okay, fair amount of controversy. The Russians are very active internationally, but their domestic market has dried up. So the Japanese companies after Fukushima. So one of the things that you look at internationally is that there isn't much demand now for nuclear energy, and partly because the costs keep going up and no one knows how long it takes to build a nuclear power plant. The labor, the very specialized labor that's necessary has basically aged out. I mean, because the people who built these things in the West in the 60s and 70s aren't there, so companies have a very hard time getting the skilled labor. The United Arab Emirates has a program where they brought South Korean companies in to build 4 power plants, the first of which is nearly done, but it's 2 years behind schedule because they haven't been able to train Emiratis to do the regulatory work. They've set up colleges to do it, but that's lagging. So kind of everywhere it's been very problematic. That isn't to say that there couldn't be a revival somehow for climate change purposes or otherwise, but right now it's in very, very difficult situation. And why I went on at that length is I think there's an implication that our community, the people who work on nonproliferation, haven't really explored yet. And that is this: one of the motivations for developing countries especially to go along with nonproliferation, to promise not to acquire nuclear weapons and to help in export controls and intelligence sharing to prevent proliferation, one of their motivations was they would then get access to nuclear energy and they would get cooperation and help to acquire nuclear energy. And so as long as that was really attractive, I had a really good motive to not acquire nuclear weapons because I was going to get something in return. But if nuclear energy is no longer attractive, but I'm still being asked to participate in export controls, allow inspections, all these other things, I say, well, there's nothing in it for me. What's in it for me? And I think that's happening at the same time, as Newell and others pointed out, there hasn't been progress towards nuclear disarmament. So from the standpoint of countries, again, mostly in the developing world, that don't have nuclear weapons, now don't find nuclear energy attractive, would want nuclear disarmament, that's not happening. They're kind of saying, what's in it for us? We're kind of getting screwed here. We at least don't want to reinvest in this system. And so I think that's something we're going to see more of, would be my expectation.
I think from my perspective, the civilian peaceful nuclear fuel cycle issue mainly comes in that if we were able to negotiate a ban treaty that includes the states that possess nuclear weapons, the understanding I think many people have is that you would not only have to create verification for their weapons complexes, but also ramp up even higher than it currently is the inspections of peaceful nuclear fuel cycle facilities. And of course, in the case of the 5 nuclear weapon states, those are states that don't currently have a high level of inspection of their facilities by the IAEA. So I think you have to take that into account. It would be a large task to ramp up IAEA activities to give you that sense of assurance that nothing's being diverted from all of those facilities. And a corollary of that is that some people urge that under a weapons ban treaty, there should be some internationalization or restrictions on enrichment and reprocessing so that it's easier to assure that additional states aren't pursuing materials that can be used in nuclear weapons. It's an interesting idea, and it's been looked at in different contexts over the decades, but it would have to be reconciled with Article 4 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty that says that the treaty won't impinge on the ability of states to pursue peaceful nuclear activities.
Justin, right here. Well, I think for C-SPAN, thank you.
Sorry, for the internet, right? Okay. Yeah. I agree that with your general argument, but I wanted to pull a thread a little bit on something that George said earlier, and that is, I'm interested in your thoughts on what international law has to say on any one of 3 sort of aspects of nuclear weapons possession. One would be nuclear strategy, sort of the how and why states would consider using nuclear weapons in extremis, or just why they possess them. Another would be nuclear posture, so what is sort of the level of planning and preparedness and then structure of one's nuclear forces, and then to the actual delivery systems and weapons themselves. And I think that you make a real valuable contribution, because I think a lot of the discussion on legality of nuclear forces has been a little sort of structured and frankly barren, a little too binary. I think you made an important contribution there. So then I'm curious as your thoughts on sort of a next level of discussion. What does international law have to say about any of those other aspects? Since I think those are the kinds of questions policymakers in the U.S. and the other nuclear states will consider in the future. Thanks.
No, I do think that's you are indeed pulling the thread on what George was talking about earlier about can you explore ways to configure nuclear arsenals and nuclear policy and strategy to be more compliant with international law. And I don't think a whole lot of work has been done on that, or if there has, I'm not that aware of it. And again, it gets down to much of what you just said, which is it implicates strategy. You know, what do you have your weapons for? What are the reasons behind possessing those nuclear weapons? Are they really just are they just for deterrence? If so, to deter what? Nuclear attack, other types of attack, or insults to your leader, or what have you. So you would have to break that down and apply international law in a factually specific way to those kinds of purposes. Posture and structure, very similar to what George was talking about. Are there ways that you could, and delivery systems, are there ways you could design your delivery systems so that, for example, you have easier recall or easier ways to interrupt, an attack that you've started? Are your forces structured in a way that, going back to the point that was made earlier, that minimizes collateral damage, maybe by low-yield weapons or that sort of approach? It gets very factually complicated, and it would be quite a task, actually. It'd be an interesting task that would involve nuclear planners, policymakers, lawyers, in probably a similar way to what the nuclear planners had to do when instructed by Obama to try to make our plans consistent with international law, but go quite a bit further because they were dealing with the strategies we have in place and the weapon systems we have in place as a static matter. And so what you're suggesting is we could even look even further at, okay, how could you change those? And could there be some sort of agreement among various countries to go down that road? I honestly, I haven't given a lot of thought to that previously. I think it's very interesting. And one criticism might be that if we're going down that road, why aren't we just going straight for nuclear disarmament? Why aren't we just spend that time and energy trying to come up with the verification schemes and the improvements in international security, the international security environment that would allow you to go on to elimination? But it raises a very interesting issue.
Thanks.
And I don't have an answer to it, I'm afraid.
This gentleman here, who I know you, and I just forgetting your name, but the problem is I do that a lot now.
I'm Gilbert Brown. I'm an emeritus professor of nuclear engineering at UMass Lowell. And I was very intrigued by the question from the lady in the corner about the, to use a $5 word, nexus between peaceful uses and what you're doing. And I did have some time at State. I wasn't privileged to engage directly, but I was around all the activity about 5, 6, 7 years ago. So, and I was focused on peaceful uses. So do you think what you're doing has an effect on peaceful uses? And I surely would have a different outlook on the prospects for nuclear power, but nuclear power isn't the only, quote, peaceful use. What are the implications of peaceful uses and the other and the related activities? Medicine or power or agriculture, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think that it is true that in an environment where at least some countries aren't parties to the NPT, there is some hesitancy to and we have not achieved elimination of nuclear weapons, there is going to be some hesitancy to engage in peaceful nuclear cooperation with countries that we may have concerns about. And that has certainly been the history of the United States. There's, at least going back in time, there were countries we were willing to engage with, and there were countries we were less willing to engage with. And some of that has eroded over time. We've expanded those that we're willing to deal with. But I think without the elimination of nuclear weapons altogether, there's always going to be that concern that, okay, we're helping this country learn a lot about peaceful nuclear activities, which they may be able to parlay into something like a weapons program. I'm not sure that's getting at your question, though.
Hang on, wait for the microphone just so the folks.
The nuclear world's different than it was in 1954, December 53, Atoms for Peace speech.
Yeah.
And we don't have all the technology like we used to.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't stop the Chinese or the Russians in particular, or the Koreans, or a handful of countries from exporting technology. So is this focus just a U.S. focus? Because we have our rules of engagement, true, as you were saying, the 1, 2, 3 agreements in particular, for exporting nuclear power plants or nuclear technology. But we're not the only ones. We may not even be the leaders anymore.
But the question would be the issues that Newell is talking about, the legality of deterrence and use, don't really spill over into the terms of nuclear cooperation for peaceful purposes, the 123 agreements, right? So,
that's just us.
right, but if the concern would be that somehow it's not a preoccupation, the attention to the legal issues of using nuclear weapons would somehow make us more restrictive in nuclear cooperation. That doesn't really happen so much, I think. I mean, it's really a strict nonproliferation focus that's not about the legality of deterrence. Yeah. No, it's a proliferation issue, and so yeah. Right. Yeah. This gentleman right here, Kayla, and then the young guy here.
Thank you very much. Sam Rising from Pacific Northwest National Lab.
Oh, yeah.
Going back to your question about the legality of strategy and posture and delivery, I found that interesting. I was wondering if we could unpack that a little bit. One of the big buzzwords in non-pro and counter-pro is entanglement, these issues of entanglement. I wonder if you could unpack a little bit how you think issues of either conscious or unconscious entanglement would affect the legality of strategy and posture and of delivery.
You'll have to tell me what you mean by entanglement. Sorry.
Sorry. So we can call it co-location of forces, conventional, and conventional forces, nuclear forces. The entanglement of C3I systems that our nuclear forces are dependent on is that we might interpret an attack on our satellite infrastructure as a threat to our nuclear deterrent, when in fact it would not be. And Chinese ballistic submarines are generally supported by conventional forces. They may assume an attack on those conventional forces in the South China Sea are again an attack on their strategic deterrent. So I was wondering if you could unpack how you think entanglement might affect these issues of strategy, posture, and delivery.
Another example, thank you. Another example is cruise missiles, where you don't know whether they're carrying a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead, and similar.
Right. Well, I mean, this is, in some ways, of course, everything's different in the nuclear context, but in some ways it's not an unusual situation in law of war analysis, where you have co-location of military forces or military supporting forces with populations. Sometimes that's the way things grew up, and then other times it's intentional to try to deter an attack by the other side. But those are the kinds of factual complexities that make it so difficult to do a proper law of war analysis in the nuclear context. In any context, I'll grant, but I think the nuclear context even more so, and particularly when you have the broad permissible targeting parameters that we have. As I said earlier, not just the forces themselves, but the war supporting activities on top of that. And so it just opens up so many targets, so much potential collateral damage, and that collateral damage is, of course, going to be greater to the extent that this entanglement takes place. The only country right now that has a no first use policy is China. Everybody else reserves the right to use nuclear force potentially in circumstances where they're being attacked by something other than nuclear weapons. And so that does open up those kinds of concerns about, okay, they're attacking our part of our command and control structure. Is that going to blind our nuclear forces, and therefore we have to launch in order to, avoid their becoming ineffectual? And so you get that complex of problems where we aren't limiting our reactions to nuclear attack, and we have certain types of things that we view as vital that are expressed in the nuclear posture reviews, periodically, that are issued by the government, and presumably some comparable type of concept for other governments as well. And those expanded areas of concern may be very highly entangled with civilian populations, with even populations overseas of our allies. So again, it's a long way of saying very factually complex, and underscores the daunting task of trying to evaluate international humanitarian law in a vacuum without specific facts to look at.
This gentleman here, Kayla.
Hello, Owen Legrone with the Arms Control Association. Earlier you were talking about sort of the application of Article 6, the foundation of the NPT, as being predicated on the notion that at that time there really were no favorable conditions for disarmament that would mean realistic disarmament in the near future during the Cold War. Recently that idea has sort of been revisited with this administration, with their creating an environment for nuclear disarmament initiative. And I was just wondering what your view was on the efficacy of such an initiative, if you think that's the only realistic way in the future, sort of a change in the entire international security environment that it might be possible to achieve disarmament.
I don't think you necessarily have to have complete elimination of international conflict to tackle nuclear disarmament, but there's certainly areas that you would have to resolve if you really want to get all of the states to give up their nuclear weapons. South Asia is one, Middle East is another, the Korean Peninsula is another. And until you have changes in the security environment that allow those countries to be willing to give up their nuclear weapons, you can't even begin the process. Well, you can begin, but it has to go parallel with the process of working out security arrangements between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China, where we are comfortable giving those up. I don't think it's an unachievable objective. I just think it's one that is difficult and is going to take time. And I don't think we're close to it, right? Honestly, in the current environment.
I just add to that. I agree with what Newell said, and part of what it would require is very unnatural for countries, societies, at least historically. So if nuclear weapons are especially attractive for weaker countries facing potentially stronger countries, all right, which if you think about how Pakistan thinks about it versus India, how the U.S. and its allies think about it in terms of Russia, how we're extending deterrence to Japan because China's bigger. Why Israel got its nuclear weapons, it feared its Arab neighbors backed by Russia. So it was generally the logic of we could be overmatched by this bigger power that would be aggressive if we didn't have nuclear weapons. That kind of requires the bigger powers to do things to not only reassure the smaller ones, but to physically, beyond my good intentions, to physically reduce my advantage. Well, who does that? I mean, there are people who do that, perhaps, but it's an unnatural act, let's say. Can you imagine getting the U.S. Congress, to say, okay, we've got an advantage here. Let's reduce the advantage in order to reassure these guys so then we can go on and get rid of nuclear weapons. I'd like to live in that world, even just to watch the debate, but it isn't the one we're in now. And if you think that's the case here, I could take you to Pakistan, or I could take you to Estonia and other places that are closer to it. That isn't to say we have anything other than to try to do it and to address the issue. But if you see it in its kind of more basic terms, it's a real challenge. Others? Yes, Arnold.
Hi, Milton Honig from the International Center of Terrorism Studies. Sort of a hypothetical question, but I want to know, is there any possibility that hypervelocity, conventionally armed hypervelocity weapons would be able to take the place, with their maneuverability and small area of impact, would be able to take the place of low-yield nuclear weapons in these theoretical scenarios that are going around now?
I can think of several people in the audience that I would trust better to answer that question than myself. I mean, there's one there, there's one there,
Or me,
there's
for
one
sure.
there. So I don't know if they want to answer it, or I mean, I would answer it from the political strategic sense, which is, I mean, that was something that President Putin was very worried about, going back at least a decade when the U.S. began talking about those systems, was this what could provide a conventional capability to destroy strategic targets and leave them at a disadvantage. And so Russia's done a lot to catch up and have that capability. But I would just add that whatever the physical capability of these systems, there's then the whole other psychological, political dimension of nuclear weapons too that I think is different. And then those two get mixed in, because it's precisely because of the different psychological effects or wrapping around conventional weapons that Putin was saying they could really use these weapons because they don't come with all the psychological baggage. So they could really use them, and it could really hurt us. Therefore, we need to counter it. And so it cuts both ways. Whatever the technology does, the psychology of it cuts both ways, I'd say. Brad Roberts. You still have to introduce yourself.
Brad Roberts, and had the pleasure of working with Newell on this. I wanted to expand the conversation in a different direction, if I could. Back to the topic of proportionality. This is one of those words that it seems to me, I mean, we all have that experience in life of talking with someone, sharing a common vocabulary, and understanding after the fact we meant something different from each other. And I have the impression that that's so with the word proportionality. A lot of people think of proportionality as having to do with the injury done, and thus the question is about the reaction to the injury done. Some think about the injury prevented, and that's of course a matter of conjecture. If we adopt simply the former definition and ask ourselves, what were Hiroshima and Nagasaki proportionate to? Well, it wasn't the last Japanese attack or the immediately preceding Japanese attack. It may not have even been the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was an entire war strategy, and the employment was in service of a particular U.S. war goal, which was unconditional surrender. So I just invite you to, and maybe in fact, for the moment, set aside the nuclear topic and explain to us what international law means when it comes to the topic of proportionality and how that differs from, as your aside at the end said about retaliation. Retaliation is not moral or legal, so what is then nuclear retaliation all about?
Well, I agree with you. Proportionality is a difficult topic, and if you read the U.S. Law of War Manual, they even go in and recognize some of the differing views on how you assess proportionality. I think that in the U.S. view, and I think probably the predominant view, as I said earlier, the goal is to not have excessive damage as compared to the legitimate military objective. So it becomes at least somewhat subjective, because what is your legitimate military objective? It does not have to be to deter, to respond to the previous attack. As I mentioned in the Kuwait example, the attack had not only dislodged the Iraqis, but it made sure the Iraqis could not, the attacks by the Iraqis could not recur. And so you measure proportionality based on that military objective, and that can include, whatever is legitimate in the context of that war. And that goes to your example of the World War II, I think. Without getting into the debate whether that particular use was permissible or not, the military objective was to end the war, and that is a permissible military objective. In fact, that is what military objectives are all about for either party. So it again doesn't mean it has to be equal force, and it doesn't mean it has to be calculated to stop the same kind of attack that just occurred. It has to be measured based on that, what can be a very broad military objective, as long as that military objective is justified under the circumstances. Again, without getting into the specifics of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I think because of that, if proportionality has that much flexibility in actual use of nuclear weapons, I think it has to have at least that much, if not more, in a nuclear deterrence context, where the whole goal, if you're successful, is that there'll be no casualties and that there'll be no attack. So that's where I come down on proportionality, but it is a complicated topic.
I want to jump in on this, because I get why Brad made the important point, and you did too, and your paper makes it very well, that what we normally think of, proportionality, if I hit you half as hard as I can, then you can hit me back half as hard as you can, and so on, and it's different. But on the other hand, the perspective that one party would give is obviously so subjective. So what I think is my requirement to end the war, or let's say in the use of nuclear weapons, I want to do it in a fairly limited way. On the other hand, I want to limit the damage you could do to me, so I'm going to add some weapons and go after your capability. So it ends up being a very large nuclear strike to achieve an ostensibly limited objective, but I say that because I needed to limit the damage and all that. It looks very disproportionate, which you could then argue it's not. It's just proportional to what I have to do, which of all of the issues kind of begs out for adjudication. You know what I mean?
I was going to say it makes it non-adjudicable.
Right.
Because you're going to have one side that has very good lawyers that argues why it was proportionate, what our objectives were, and why this was essential to accomplishing those objectives. And the other side, who's maybe third parties who are standing back and saying, "Oh, you just devastated that country. Right. How do you justify that?"
Right. That's why it's tough. Yeah, it's why juries are good.
Who's your jury, though?
No, I know it. Look, I get it. I mean, I remember, Robert McNamara after, in the Fire War saying, Hiroshima, or at least Nagasaki, probably would have been adjudged a war crime. And you look at the pictures and the slides they gave to Stimson of Hiroshima and the little typed things that said this was a uniform factory and this was a Jeep factory and it was a legitimate military target. And so it does kind of ask for somebody other than the winner to preside over whether the arguments that it was proportional or defensible arguments or not. And I think, the last point on this one is especially I find that the argument that supporters of the Prohibition Treaty make, and I don't support the treaty, but their argument, especially those who come from countries that would not be belligerents, all right? They get no benefit from nuclear deterrence. They don't rely on nuclear deterrence, not their fight, but very possible that the radiation or if there's nuclear winter or other things would seriously harm them and materially harm them. They're kind of going, wait a minute, those guys get to choose, and then there's nobody who even evaluates it after. I get why then they reach for these other instruments, which I would argue aren't going to work either. But then if we just say tough, we've got our lawyers, and no one's even going to hear your lawyers because there's no mechanism to hear it. I just think that's going to be harder to sustain going forward with it.
I would add one more point on proportionality. I cite the oil platforms case in the paper, which was an ICJ decision that looked at that issue, whether where the U.S. believed that or could prove that attacks on tankers were coming from Iranian oil platforms, and therefore the U.S. attacked the oil platforms, and the U.S. vigorously defended its decision. And the ICJ disagreed with it. And there's a case where the court comes in and says, no, you did not have, that was not a legitimate attack under the laws of war. And, then the U.S. criticizes the decision. So.
Yes, ma'am.
But what about discrimination of civilians in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It seems just blatantly clear that they had no problem killing many, many civilians.
I really don't want to get into that debate, but it's the problem of nuclear weapons. I'll just say that discrimination is an issue, is a problem, and I will grant that the low yield help with that issue of discrimination potentially, but there's always the risk of escalation, and low yield perhaps increase the chances that there's going to be a nuclear exchange. Right now we have sort of a moral taboo since 1945 against the use of nuclear weapons. There have been occasions where they could have been used in various conflicts, and they weren't. And I worry that if we go down this road of, well, it's not that bad if one side uses a tactical nuclear weapon and the other side responds with a tactical nuclear weapon. I worry about that scenario because I don't think these things are easily containable. But discrimination is no question is a problem with nuclear weapons, and it's a problem with some other weapons too, but nuclear weapons more so, and particularly if you have this entanglement issue that was discussed before.
I just would add one thing on your very pointed question, which was there had already been years of firebombing, and so the principle of discrimination had long gone away, which isn't that's not a remotely satisfactory answer to your question. It's a kind of an historical descriptor about it, and in the sense that there was already wanton destruction, both in Europe and in the Pacific, including that by Japanese forces. Well, so nobody was playing by the laws of armed conflict and Japanese use of biological weapons against China, and so it was a whole mess. So I think the thing to learn from that, and at the same time to be vigilant about, is that the world has developed a lot more international law since then, precisely for that reason. But they also had made declarations, the month before World War II started, there were declarations about not targeting civilians, and then within months that went out the window. So the vigilance is, yes, we have international law now, and it's growing, but, beware how quickly it could be traduced or ignored, which was why bringing up the research Scott Sagan's done about public opinion, I think, is relevant, that we think we have these structures and these principles, but we can imagine, or should imagine, how quickly they could be discarded, and therefore what you need to do to strengthen them. I think is one of the reasons Newell's written this, and that we're having this discussion. I got Susan Cook, and we'll take one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Really following up on what you just said, question first is there a moral and legal difference between Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki from the standpoint of civilian casualties, discrimination? And then the question of Nagasaki is the last use of nuclear weapons. We've been on a pretty impressive run for nuclear deterrence. What is the moral and legal judgment about making it easier to have conventional war without the threat of nuclear weapons, if nuclear weapons are eliminated?
Well, taking the second question, I touch on that a little bit in my paper, and there, as with virtually every issue in the nuclear field, there are arguments on both sides as to whether the nuclear era is responsible for what is apparently a historically low period of people dying from violence and the absence of war between the great powers, and those who feel like, no, it's really other factors, it wouldn't have happened anyway. After World War II, the horrors were just so great that everybody reassessed the benefits of engaging in those kinds of great power wars. Obviously, there's no answer to that question, but it is something you do have to think about. If it is the case that the fear of use of nuclear weapons has been one of the restraining factors that have kept countries from taking that, maybe additional step where, in Vietnam or Korea or what have you, all of a sudden it turns into a great power conflict, not just a regional conflict. Unknowable, unfortunately. And as for the difference between, Dresden/Tokyo and Hiroshima/Nagasaki, under the law of war, there should be no differences. I said every state that participated in the ICJ decision agreed that the laws of war apply to nuclear weapons the same as they apply to conventional weapons. So you would be applying those same precepts. Are you engaging in warfare in a way that allows you to discriminate and that is minimizing collateral damage?
Okay, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Newell, and then we'll thank you. Thank you very much.